Alright, if you've been following this since I started it, you'll know that I was aiming to do a book a week. And that means that, by my calculations anyway, I should have gotten books done in January. Instead, I only got three, and that was due to having a very busy week. Um, and then I fell ill for a little bit, and it was just a bit of a mess. And so I ended up finishing Mattimeo 1st of February. However, I'm already making good progress on Mariel, and so we should be on track to get things done. Welcome back to the Redwall retrospective. Um, Mattimeo, not as good as I remembered in some ways, but it managed to pull itself back together. I mentioned during my Mossflower review that it felt like for most of the book it was actually really good, with one point where it sort of dipped. Matameo's problems cover most of it, um, and some of them are pretty glaring. None of them I'd say like kill it. It's still a very good book, um, but I was disappointed a little bit, and I think that comes from my understanding of plot structure and um, character knowledge versus reader knowledge that I've gained in the like decade since I last read this intensely. Might be a little less than a decade now that I think about it. I'm not that old. Um, let me pull up my notes. Um, right off the bat, I want to give Jake's compliments for his cast. The cast of Mattimeo is actually pretty darn solid, and I won't spend too long on it, but I wanted to sort of get that going. Slagar is a returning character, technically, but he feels very different from Chicken Hound in the first book, and I think that is a good thing. There we go. Slagar feels distinct enough from both Sarmina and Clooney to make him his own character. His motives feel a little muddied at times. Um, and it feels like there are a couple of places where he has a revelation that he should have had way earlier, or like his actions feel a little more inconsistent. They become more generic evil instead of the very focused evil that he's introduced as. And a lot of his cunning tricks later on pale in comparison to the brilliance of the plan on the first night. Though that may simply be because he had more time to plan that first night, um, and thus made it a proper show. Um, really, that reflects on a lot of the early parts of the book, and I think Slagar's strength throughout sort of reflects on the quality of the book, except at the very end. The very end is very good. Um, I'll get to that in a little bit, but early on, Slagar utterly brilliant. Um, Masterfully plans this masquerade and the trickery of the Redwallers and the murder and kidnapping, and it's brilliant and it's beautifully laid out. And Jakes does a great job with it. And really, that reflects on a lot of the first part of the book, um, more or less up until like the whole finding of the riddle business. And I'll get to that. Um, the losses early on feel impactful. We lose Friar Hugo, which is a great loss. And there's the whole chase through the woods trying to figure out where um, the band went. And while I feel they get going a little too soon, like they should have stopped at Redwall, had a quick meeting, and gathered supplies before they set off. It's not too bad. Um, and the party that Matthias ends up forming feels like it coalesces naturally and feels well balanced. You've got Matthias and Orlando as the great big fighting types. Um, you've got Jabez and Basil as their sort of fist and foot fighters. You've got Jess doing support. You've got Log and the entire Guzum tribe, and it's a really nice little war party by the time they make it to Lomhedge and Malkaris. Oh, right, and Sir Henry the Muse, of course. Can't forget him. And Cheek. Cheek is an excellent character. Um, and I noticed. So, in the first review, I noticed that Sam Squirrel gets a little too much screen time and tends to steal the show. In this, Sam Squirrel's fine. He's actually very well balanced with the other characters. Maybe could have even had a little more of him. Um, Here, Baby Rollo and Cheek seem to be Jake's darlings. Um, and the time, because he's got two, the time split between them feels a lot more natural. Um, and so it feels like he's figured out how to balance that better. So Baby Rollo and Cheek are both definitely present, and they never feel like they're suddenly missing, except when they're supposed to be. Uh, but they feel like they're present, but not too, but they don't outstay their welcome the way Sam did in the first book. We get some pretty quick demonstrations of Slagar's power early on as he kills one of his subordinates, um, and ends up killing, I think, two Redwallers, seriously wounding another two, if I remember correctly. Um, the Spara. This is the last time the Spara appear, to my recollection, and um, their presence is um, not as important as it was in the first book, but still vital, and I think they are used well. Even though we lose Warbeak as a character, and that feels kind of sad. It delays Matthias's party, which I think works as a plot device. Um, Jake's food descriptions are on point as always. Um, I think Mattimeo is when they really start to get going. Like Mariel's got some really good stuff in the early parts I've noticed, but Mattimeo, read this just for the food. This is the first book where I'm willing to say read this just for Jake's food descriptions. The other two, Musflower and Redwall, good, but not quite to that level yet. This is where it starts getting good on that front. Unfortunately, it's also, thus far, the place with the biggest plot hole I have encountered. How does the map know about the chasm if Lomehedge is buried by the earthquake that causes the chasm, and the Lomehedge mice leave before that chasm forms? It's like it feels. Also, the Longtail Horde. How long has the Longtail Horde been there? Time in general is kind of hard to track in Redwall because it's measured in seasons, and there are very few definite numbers. I believe that's intentional. But it feels very confusing as to the order of events. Like, do the Lomehedge mice leave because of the plague? And then as they're building Redwall, the earthquake occurs, and so they go to check it out, and they find the Longtail Horde has moved in. They manage to get past it to find the buried part of Lomehedge and figure it's exactly the right distance from the Lord of Mossflower, which is really far from Mossflower to be called the Lord of Mossflower when you think about it. It's just the whole Southern Lands portion feels like much more of a mess than the Journey to Salamandastron did. And so I'm a little wary on that score. Um, quick note: the kidnapping and murder is all done off screen, which is actually a brilliant move. It means Jakes doesn't have to illustrate it on the one hand, and it also means that it has almost more impact. Um, Slagar's motivation for keeping the young ones alive is good, and that means that we don't just have Mattimeo die right off the bat. Slagar wields a bolo, which is a really cool weapon and one I wish we saw more of, though not too much of. Having too much of a good thing just makes it no longer a good thing. Um, let's see what else we got. Right, we got. I do feel like Jubilation, Jube the Hedgehog could have been used a little more. He's okay. Alma is very mature for her age. She's my guess is she'd be on the older end of the slave train. Um, but it's okay. She acts as the sort of voice of reason for Mattimeo's party. Mattimeo's development does feel a little rushed at points, but it works out by the end. Um, we get Orlando. He's great. Um, most of like Slagar's troop is fun, but I'm not really gonna. I don't really feel the need to talk about any of them. I think that the whole mutiny scene works in that we don't know enough about them to really care which of the Stoats and Weasels lives or dies, and so we're just happy to let them fight amongst each other. Um, there's overall a lot of things that I think are really good, but then there's a couple issues here and there, and some of those are very personal, and some of those are my sort of observations on writing quality. Again, that very big plot hole, that discrepancy in what the map talks about and what's carved on the Abbey window, and how it lines up like near perfectly with what the party goes through. Um, it's it annoys me. The other thing that annoys me plot wise is that the Loam Hedge translation is so perfect. I study Latin, and I can tell you with confidence that Latin's not all that far off from other from the Romance languages, Italian, French, etc. And it's really the thing is, even with that little distance, there's not you never get a perfect translation. If Loam's would say a cipher, I could believe it. But given that Loam's script is implied to be a like ancient language on the level of Latin, this is a dead language that only scholars read, or a dead writing system. Um, it feels to me that this should either have been translated into like an older, more archaic form of English, even like the early modern English of Shakespeare, or Chaucer. Um, yeah, it bugs me, but that's very much me speaking as someone with some familiarity with translation having an issue rather than um, an issue necessarily with the writing. I think it's a good idea to have it in a script that you need special skills to or special knowledge to decipher. That's cool, but the translator in me. Um, Martin's spirit comes into play a few times, but not enough for it to really be an issue. The sort of Martin's durability bugs me a little bit, but it's not too bad given that we know from Mossflower that's forged from a fallen star, and it's thus magic. Um, the Spara moving out as the rooks move in feels very clever, and the rooks arriving at Redwall gives the Redwallers something to worry about while Matthias and co are out hunting, and so it helps balance the story. Um, on that note, Mrs. Churchmouse, very good character. Cornflower has moved from being one note to two note. She still doesn't feel fully fledged. Um, she's now at the point where she goes between being sort of a mischievous trickster in like her scaring the rooks and her plans for the protection of Redwall, and the other one she has the other mode she has is motherly, where she worries about Matthias and Mattimeo and takes care of baby Rollo, and it feels like she just has those two um like states, and so she doesn't feel as fully fledged as I think she could be, and that frustrates me a little bit. It's like you had this opportunity to make her better, and she does not feel that much better. She's better than in Redwall. Um, and I think part of that it has to deal with how comfortable Jakes was at this time with writing relationships. Um, but eh, what can you do? Very little. Except continue on with the notes. Let me see. Um, Slagar struck me as more wimpish than either Sarmina or Clooney, but more threatening because what he was threatening was much smaller. He wasn't threatening the whole abbey with a horde. He was threatening the slave line and the young ones of Redwall. Um, in and his forces were sufficient to feel threatening, but still not as deadly as Clooney, kill, kill, kill. Um, Painted ones are a weirdly small moment. They're okay. Wish they were better. Um, it's interesting. I do think it's interesting how Clooney's party goes under cover of night and avoids the worst of them, and Matthias and co have to be resourceful to get out of um, the forest. Um, yeah, the longtails, Stoneflake and the longtails annoy me a lot because have they just been there the whole time? Like since Lonehedge was abandoned, or since the poem was written, or how long have these guys been here? And what do they do besides be a horde of seemingly endless numbers of stone gray rats wielding only bows? They feel more like an obstacle than like a army or a people. Um, and I put that in contrast to the Verdaz and the voice of the host and all the black cloaked rats. They actually feel somewhat threatening. Um, though, yeah, I'll get to that in a second, probably. I keep saying I'll get to it. When am I going to get to it? That's the issue with like being somewhat disorganized. I've been recording for like 20 minutes already. Um, let's see. Oh, the second mention of horses in the entirety of Redwall is in this book. Um, and in Sister May, noting that she's mixed up enough, she's put enough of the concoction on the strawberries to knock out a horse. Um, and that knocks out the magpies. And that's a great eight moment. But it is, again, the second and I think final mention of horses in the entirety of Redwall. No mentions of beavers, however. Sad. Let's see. I've got a note here. Even when supplies are short, Jakes lays out a feast. That's another thing that Jakes does very well is he manages to make a great deal out of simple food, which I have a great respect for. That's right. It's Nadaz, not Verdaz or whatever he says. Um, Nadaz, voice of the host, and all of his rats. Were Rat, the champion versus Matthias is a great fight. The whole, well, I don't like the whole quest to get to Lonehedge. Once they actually get there and once they actually get down, it feels like a great. It feels like straight out of a D&D adventure. I can hear the dice rolling. You've got this like company-sized group of like a ton of shrews. I'm not sure, like maybe two platoons instead of a company, whatever. Um, but you got this small army of shrews, and you've got this like gargantuan badger warrior, and you've got Matthias, and you've got Jess and Basil and Cheek, and you have this and Jabez, and you got this whole force marching down into the Underdark to fight against the evil rats, which are a proper horde. And there are losses, and there are the force takes damage, but Logalog is wounded and dies, but he's able to fulfill his promise to free the young ones before he does so, and so he feels great satisfaction at that. Um, And it also feels good that like Slagar is delayed when he gets there. He's not able to just like get out. He has to like wait around and figure out if he's going to get his payment for bringing in all the slaves. Um, and so that feels good. And again, the whole battle under Lomhenge, the battle in the realm of Malcares, is great. And probably my favorite part of the book. My other favorite part of the book, and in fact, I've got marked here character highlight Sister May. Sister May is a fantastic character, and she is central to the whole part of the book with Strick Redkite. Um, and Strick actually like she turns a sort of eh okay arc of the Redwallers versus Ironbeak's encroaching forces into an actually really fun conclusion with like Strix and Constance's sudden attack as Ironbeak breaks into Cavern Hole, and it's like it's a great sort of final moment. And it means that none of the Redwallers have to be responsible for killing Ironbeak. You instead have this kite who, who fights to defend the Abbey, um, after a very rapid recovery, um, that feels fairly natural. It doesn't feel forced or like an ex machina. It feels like it works. And Sister May, just throughout, is she's that constant presence. She has a personality. She's got both a good degree of competence and a humility that makes it work. And she just feels like a well-rounded character. I think Sister May is more well-rounded than uh, Cornflower. Most of the other characters pretty darn solid. I miss Friar Hugo. Friar Hugo was great. He's fabulous for the few, like couple of chapters we have him. Um, and so his loss is missed. Um, Slagar's end is to falling into a pit that he just climbed out of. Um, in other words, it's to hubris, thinking himself so clever. Um, and you know that it works. Um, Father Abbott, we have come home is a great line towards the end. Um, and I think to really sum it up, got two things. While Mossflower made me want to keep reading in spite of its missteps, Mattimeo does not. Mattimeo's plot holes are a little too glaring. That was my sort of big thing with Mattimeo. One of my sort of limited tests for whether a book is good or not is does it make me want to keep reading? It's not a foolproof test. There are some excellent books that, are pretty bad at that. Lord of the Rings is a great example. It's not a book that you want to keep reading. You've got to work at it. You've got to put in energy to reading Lord of the Rings, at least in several parts of it. But it's a fantastic book that you get something different out of every time. Mossflower, for all of its faults and weaknesses, especially that sort of fourth, fifth, um, it made me want to keep reading on and see how it ended. Mattimeo, for a good chunk of it, didn't. And I think that's part of what took me so long on it. It just felt like there's a section, it's like a lot of books from fairly early authors. It's got a weak middle. Even experienced authors frequently have weak middles. But like, it manages to pull itself together and find its footing for a glorious finale. And the epilogue ends up feeling natural. Everything that um like it makes sense, and it's like we've got this sort of hint of a relationship between Orlando and Constance, but it's not explicit. We've got, Mattimeo and Tess Churchmouse together, which, Tess is well rounded enough that you can see why, she and Mattimeo would make a good pairing. It's fine. We've got Tim taking over as recorder. Um, it's overall just a very nice, and we've got all these sort of like half hints of things that make it seem like this really is an excerpt from the records a daily log rather than an exposition dump. And I think that's what Jakes is starting to really roll with the epilogues. Is it's not it's exposition, but it's very subtle exposition. It's done well. So I love that he starts opening and closing the books with the epilogues and with the excerpts from the records. And so I recommend Mattimeo. It's good. Um, it's got a very weak middle, probably the weakest middle since. Actually, I think it's got a weaker middle than Redwall, frankly. Um, at least in some ways. Redwall's middle is kind of complicated by the fact that it doesn't really know what plot lines it wants to have. Mattimeo knows what plot lines it has, but because of that, the weak middle is a lot more obvious. Mossflower had the right balance of things where its middle was okay, and really only started to fall at the where everything is supposed to look darkest bit, and that's where it felt weakest. It's okay. Um, I'm making good progress on Mariel. Should have a video of it sometime. I'm hoping to catch up soonishly on my books. I was supposed to get 4 books done in January. Only got 3. We're gonna try and catch that up with ideally. Well, let me think. February's got exactly 4 weeks, um, and so uh, I guess I'll try and do 4 books in February. Try and squeeze in a fifth or like 4.5 or something. Figure something out. I won't push myself more than I really need to, but I'd like to keep on track with the getting them all done within 6 months goal. Thank you for watching or listening, as the case may be. Um, and I will see you next time I manage to get around to recording one of these. Apologies for the delay. Next one should be a bit sooner. Thank you.